Hello and welcome back to Good Reads. I'm the host, Jim Hall, and today we're going to feature a book, The Rouge River Revived. We're going to meet with authors John Hartag and Jim Graham, and they're going to tell us about this wonderful book that talks about the history of reviving the Rouge River. So we're going to jump right in today, and we're going to talk with John. John Hartag tells us about how the book came to be.
We didn't decide that we were going to do the book. Other people decided for us. There were some people who loved the Rouge, and one in particular who had a passion for this and approached me a couple of times, and I was just too busy, and the pressure continued, and they said, we need an edited book on the Rouge to tell this amazing national story and really binational story. It's part of the Great Lakes. And so I called up Jim, we talked about it, and we felt between us we had lots of good friends and colleagues that we could draw upon to tell this story. Everything from Native American history, history of settlement, the automobile story, all the way to the cleanup, to re-engaging people with the river through citizen science, through cleanup activities, through the lower Rouge River water trail, and today now trying to pass this on as a gift to future generations. One of the unusual stories is a story. Jim Murray was the Washtenaw County Drain Commissioner. He went on to become the chairman of the Michigan Water Resources Commission. He grew up in the watershed, and he made it his passion to herd cats and bring all the communities together and the three counties. So Jim he knew how to make a point. So he gets Ed McNamara, at the time, Wayne County executive. He gets John Dingell, the dean of the U.S. Congress, and we go down in Melvindale to the Rouge River. Of course, in Melvindale, it's part of the concrete channel. So we have to carefully walk our way down the channel and not slip on any algae that's growing on the concrete. And of course, we've got the dean of Congress and we got the county executive. And Jim gets us down there and he points down the river and says, "What is that?" And everyone looks around, and it turns out it's raw sewage and everything else. And his goal was to shock these two gentlemen so much that they would go back and become champions for this. The end of that story is John Dingell went back and raised $350 million that leveraged another over $650 million to address combined sewer overflows and urban stormwater runoff.
Next up, John talks about a couple of important points that he hopes people take away after reading the book.
Many people think that the Rouge River is out there and it's separate from us. As an aquatic scientist, we like to teach the difference between environment and ecosystem is like the difference between house and home. House is out there, it's across the street. It's external and detached from us. But home is something you see yourself in even when not there. So we are part of our ecosystem. What we do to it, we do to ourselves. The second part of that is that we're hoping that everyone can learn is that no one can do this alone. No state government, not the federal government, not a county, or even a few cities. It takes everyone working together, including citizens, and they have to do their share, whether it's supporting Friends of the Rouge, or being involved in Rouge Rescue, or participating in citizen science, or recycling, or helping with a green infrastructure project.
Next up, we meet co-editor Jim Graham. Jim takes the time to tell us a little bit about the book and some of the things that he thought are very interesting in regards to the book.
It's been a real story of cooperation and dedication in putting our book together, we went to people who were intimately involved in the restoration of the river, from people who know the history, the geology, the programs that are in place now, things that were done, and now things that are still being done through Friends of the Rouge and through other organizations. They've branched out so far. We started out just basically doing an annual cleanup. And the attitude at that time was everything that's in the river needs to come out of the river. And so we'd get people, one of my lasting impressions is a line of people pulling on a rope to pull a part of a log jam up. You'd get 8 or 10 or 12 people, you know, from all ages, and it was wonderful. And people down in the river, you know, there's a guy named Bill Craig, who I think who must have gills by now. He spent so much time in the river with his chainsaw, cutting all the log jams out. He's one of those ones who's really dedicated, still is. Things have progressed now to where where the Friends of the Rouge is particularly involved in things like bank stabilization. We've got just dirt, and well, what happens if dirt goes in the river? No big deal, right? Well, it can kill the fish, and we've got fish, and that's one of the neat things. You can fish in the river now. You can catch the fish, eat the fish. People are canoeing, kayaking, hiking. It's become a real community resource instead of being a trash dump. And that's something that we can all feel really good about. So I'm particularly pleased with that aspect of the restoration of the river.
Obviously, the Rouge River is important to both of these men. I took the time to ask Jim Graham, could he express to us why the Rouge River is so important to him?
I know from having spent a lot of time on the river and talked to a lot of other people who hadn't spent that much time but were there to see, they can't believe they're in suburban Detroit. They think they're up north somewhere. And it's a great feeling. You know, I've been out in canoes, canoeing on the river. Back when I was doing it, there were still a lot of log jams, so it was kind of a challenge. And it still is a bit, but there's enough people who are absolutely committed to making sure that the river is a resource, that they're out there taking care of things like that. And so now you can go into the city of Wayne, put into the river there, and go all the way down to the Detroit River. And you won't believe what you see. The wildlife, the birds, the animals, deer, and all sorts of critters that you don't think of as being part of suburban Detroit. But here we are. And there they are. It's wonderful.
One of the wonderful things about the revival of the Rouge River is the wildlife that has come back. Next up, Jim Graham tells us about the wildlife and some of the new things we're seeing because of the revival at the Rouge River.
One of the things that I think is really significant, and most people might not even believe, but there are now beaver back in the Rouge River watershed. I've seen them near Dearborn, Dearborn Heights. One of the women that works at Friends of the Rouge has them in her backyard, Sally Petrella. She's seeing, and beaver is one of the reasons that this whole area was settled. Back in the colonial days, the French and others came to the Michigan area, to this area, to trap beaver and to sell their pelts. Beaver hats were very popular back then. And so the beaver were almost extirpated. That's one of John's words. It means that they were locally almost extinct. So the fact that hundreds of years later we're now seeing beaver again that's more part of a really good news story. The book's available at a lot of local bookstores, Barnes & Noble in particular. It's also available on Amazon and available directly through the University of Michigan Press, which is the publisher of the book.
Before we close for today, we're going to visit with John Hartig one more time as John tells us what still needs to be done with the Rouge River revival.
The Rouge River is an urban river. 23% of the watershed is impervious surface. It's parking lots, it's rooftops, it's roads, it's sidewalks. That's where water runs off. Ecologists like that to be less than 10%. So we have a long ways to go to better manage stormwater, to build green infrastructure. Coupled with that, climate change is the most pressing challenge of our time. With climate change comes increasing intensity and frequency of storms. So Rouge is an urban watershed. You get more flooding on the Rouge Parkway. You get more flooding in people's basements. So that's gonna, ecologists talk about it as a threat multiplier. It makes doing the other things much more difficult. The other issue we have to deal with is contaminated sediments. Literally the lower end of the river where all the industry is, you can find, it's the legacy of the Industrial Revolution and the arsenal of democracy. There's about 350,000 cubic meters of contaminated sediments that have to be cleaned up, remediated. The good news is we have the Great Lakes Legacy Act. They will provide 65% of the cost, but that leaves 35% of the cost that has to be from non-federal partners. The cities don't have that kind of money. The counties don't have that kind of money. So we're going to need industrial partners and the state of Michigan to help make that possible. A once-in-a-generation opportunity to address a problem that's been around for at least 100 years.
Well, that'll just about do it for this episode of Good Reads. I really hope you go out there and track down this book. It's a really interesting read. It's a wonderful part of our history here in Michigan, an absolutely beautiful river. It's, as I say, a wonderful read, so I hope you track it down. I thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next month on Good Reads.